And I don't want to be rude, but you know, really, you have the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. And the question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask, is who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you.
Well, I'm Nigel Farage. I lead the UK Independence Party in the United Kingdom. We've had a big climb in the polls recently, and there was a poll on Sunday that put us on 16% of the vote, which is remarkable given that it's a first-past-the-post electoral system. I'm also a member of the European Parliament. I've been here since 1999, and I currently jointly lead the Europe of Freedom and Democracy group in the Parliament, which is the only group in this Parliament that could genuinely be said to be providing a voice of opposition to what is going on inside the European Union. Well, all through the history of mankind, you know, going back tens of thousands of years, you have a status quo. You have a group of people who are in charge and who don't like their positions to be threatened or their ideas to be threatened. And this happens in science, you know, where Galileo gets put in prison and Darwin is considered to have gone mad. And it happens in business when someone like Ryanair comes along and all the big companies say he's cheating and it shouldn't be allowed. And the same thing happens in politics. And what we've done really as UKIP is to come along and to challenge a status quo that has made a lot of people very rich. Not just the politicians, but the civil servants even more so. So, I mean, rather like slavery. You know, when Wilberforce wanted to abolish slavery, the vested interest, the people making money out of it, opposed him, and it took him a long time. And we came along and questioned the wisdom of the whole European project, and they have made life incredibly difficult for me from day one. And it takes the form, well, it takes several forms. I mean, one is that they try to ignore you, and so you get the conventional media in the early days not allowing the arguments that you're putting forward to sort of see the light of day. Then, of course, it goes through the abusive phase, whereby anybody that thinks national flags should be more important than European flags is slagged off as being extreme, neo-fascist, you know, you name it. And yeah, you know, I have had considerable obstruction and unpleasantness put in my way over a very, very long time. But if they thought they were going to be if they really thought they were going to frighten me off, well, they picked the wrong person. I think things have changed. I think the entire media perception of UKIP and its arguments has changed. I think there's more than one reason for it, but at the heart of it is the fact that we've been right. You know, I've said for 20 years that this wasn't a free trade club, that ultimately it was about the creation of a state. And now we have Commission President Mr. Barroso being very clear that he wants a federal union in Europe with one army, one police force, one flag, and he wants it to be a state. So I think being right about things makes a big difference. And I think secondly, on the Eurozone, you know, we said from the start Britain should never join because it would be a disaster, and so it is proving. And maybe not in France, visibly, at the moment, but very visibly in the Mediterranean. The euro has brought untold job losses and human suffering and violence on the streets. And my message to France is, it's coming to you as well. It's coming to you as well, because the fundamental imbalance that exists between the Mediterranean and Germany in economic and social terms, I'm afraid it's mirrored by the gap that exists between France and Germany, and that gap is getting bigger. Purely in economic terms, it is very, very difficult when you have diverse economies. Diverse in terms of the sectors in which they operate. You know, some are manufacturing sectors, some are service sectors, some rely you know, on tourism rather than making cars, if you like. Very difficult for one interest rate to fit a variety of countries who have different economic cycles. But secondly, it's been very difficult to have one currency and one interest rate for a group of countries with different levels of national and private debt. I mean, this was so obvious to many of us from the start. And so you finish up with countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland who join a Eurozone, who see their interest rates halve overnight, 7 years of free money. I mean, it's like the champagne glass being filled up every 30 seconds. It all seems like terrific fun while it's going on. And that led to a completely false boom in those economies. And then since 2008, when we've had the downturn after various international banking problems, then you see economies trapped with the most appalling debt burden, trapped inside a currency that is much too high for where they are in terms of their economic cycle, and countries are becoming more uncompetitive with every month that passes by. And the question really now is, how do we solve this? And I'm fearful that if we don't get a proper political solution, in that people start voting for parties who've got different messages, then I'm afraid we're going to see violence on a very, very large scale and social breakdown in these countries. Well, I mean, I think, the referendum route is very interesting. I mean, you're right that the Danes and twice the Irish have been forced to run referendums again. In the case of France, when you said no to the Constitution back in 2005, I was in Paris that evening, it was great fun. When you said no, they just ignored you. And they got rid of the C word, the Constitution word, and replaced it with the Lisbon Treaty. My message to people is simple. If you don't want these things, don't go on voting for politicians and political parties that have put you in this position in the first place. So we need to change people's voting patterns, fundamentally change their voting patterns. I'm slightly nervous of it. I mean, what I do think is that in the 1960s and 70s, it is quite easy to understand why many of the big American authorities supported the growth of a political Europe. I mean, don't forget, they had 500,000 men, armed men, in Europe to protect us against a possible Soviet invasion. The price to America of maintaining European peace and security after 1945 was huge, and we would do well to remember that. Too often, I think, I hear people here in Brussels, and perhaps often in France even more so, being really pretty unpleasant about the Americans. And I think it would do for everyone just to take a step back and to realise their contribution actually to freeing us from Nazism and then from holding off the threat from Stalin and others was very significant and very, very important. I don't support much of current American foreign policy, and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are not to my liking, but they saw Europe coming together as a means of saving themselves a lot of money. So there was a political push, but the idea that it's all Goldman Sachs behind the whole project, I might have reservations about Goldman Sachs, but I just don't buy the argument. If, let's say we were Greek, sitting here right now, and we're trapped inside a currency that is probably 65% overvalued for where the drachma would be on the international exchanges. Clearly, if there is a devaluation with a return to the drachma, there is going to have to be a substantial debt write-off. There's already been a huge debt write-off for private bondholders. It's just the Germans as yet, particularly the Germans and everybody else, hasn't yet taken their losses as governments, given the amount they put in to prop up Greece. That will come at some point in time. And yes, if you're an economy that is importing most of your goods and your currency falls very sharply, there are huge potential inflationary rises. But there are two things that definitely happen with the Greek devaluation. The first is that it becomes an incredibly attractive place for us to for all of us to go to Greek islands and spend holidays on. And it is their biggest industry, and that would thrive. Secondly, what Greece gets is its own parliament back in Athens that is actually in control, rather than being told by foreign bureaucrats from the so-called troika what they can and can't do. So I think at least a level of self-respect would come back with democracy. And thirdly, what you hope happens is this. Because the cost of imported goods goes through the roof, let's say for argument's sake, a broom to sweep your front door. Let's say that at the moment it's costing 15, but after devaluation it's costing 25. What you hope happens is that somebody in Athens says, do you know what? We can manufacture these a lot cheaper than we can import them. And you hope that what happens in that situation is that the country starts to become productive again and starts to make its own things. And frankly, if you look at what's happened to Iceland, I mean, don't forget that in 2008, not being part of the Eurozone, Iceland wasn't bailed out. There were massive defaults, bank defaults on private investors. She had inflation over 20%, interest rates at 20%, the currency fell 80%, and then there was a volcanic eruption. And it was like the Old Testament. It was so dramatic what was going on. But here we are 4 years on, and Iceland's back in growth. And I think this scenario is the only hope the Greeks have got of getting back to some form of social, political, and economic stability. Really? So would the Germans have invaded France again, would they? I mean, in which year would the Germans have invaded France again? Which German president would have invaded France? Helmut Schmidt? Willy Brandt? It's all rather insulting, isn't it? Well, I know the Germans did invade you 3 times in 70 years, so it's not a very good track record, and I accept that. But do we really think that the Germans are that evil and that bad that it's somehow within them that they have to go across and kill lots of French people? I find it rather insulting. I think that what happened to Germany in 1945 is she was completely smashed to smithereens. Just look at the pictures of Berlin, of Hamburg, of those big cities. She was destroyed, she was humiliated, and she was humbled in a way that didn't happen in 1918 and should, in my view, have happened in 1918, but we can't rewrite history. And I think that what the Germans did after 1945 was to build their own parliamentary democracy for the first time. It's been hugely successful. And I mean, by the mid-1980s, Germany wasn't just one of the richest countries on earth, it was one of the happiest countries on earth, with some of the lowest divorce rates and, by all the measures of a settled society that's doing well. So no, I think, that argument to me is absolute rubbish. But it's the sort of thing these overpaid bureaucrats will tell you, because they've got, there isn't much else they can defend. They can't defend the economic record because it's failing. They can't defend their fisheries record because stocks are at record lows. All they can do is say, oh, well, without this, there would have been war. No evidence to back that up at all. But they're very good here at using vast amounts of taxpayers' money to tell the same taxpayers what a wonderful job they're doing. It doesn't work with me. The first disastrous mistake that we made in England, which of course has a very big banking sector, was to transfer regulation of the banks, as we did in 1997, from the Bank of England, who had been doing it since 1694, and quite effectively, and we handed all that to a new generation of tick-box bureaucrats in a big glass and steel building in a place called Canary Wharf in East London. None of whom had ever worked in banking, but all of whom had failed at something and were promoted to this financial services authority as a sort of a thank you from Mr. Blair and his friends. So getting rid of expert regulation of the banks was crazy, and allowing good, sensible rules to go out of the window was the biggest single contributory factor. I mean, look, when I first went to buy a house in the late 1980s, I had to put up a deposit of nearly 20% of the value of the house down as cash, and I wasn't allowed to take out a mortgage that was more than 3.5 times my annual salary. They were the rules. And we understood that, and they'd been the rules of the mortgage market for a very, very long time. By the time 2008 came along, we had little banks and building societies lending 125% of the value of a house. So that you got not just the value of the house, but another 25%, which you could, buy new windows or a new car, or whatever you wanted. And they were lending people at ratios of up to 7 times what somebody in the house was earning. And the whole thing got completely out of control. And, good basic banking business rules were done away with in what was seen to be this brave new world, that somehow everything had changed. And, I just would remind people that if you look at Canada, with quite an active banking sector, look at Australia, with quite an active banking sector, not a single bank in those countries has received government help since 2008 because they stuck to the old rules. When I worked for Credit Lyonnais for some years, and we were trying to do business in America, we had to live with the Glass-Steagall Act. So I understand through my business working life Glass-Steagall and how it operates. It used to annoy me a bit, but in reality, I think Glass-Steagall, I think the way that London had, we had completely separate investment banks and clearing banks up until 1986. They were completely different companies with different rules. And I do think, as somebody that spent 20 years in the financial services industry, I do think that we need genuine reform of the banking system. And yes, I would like to see a return to separate investment banks and clearing banks. And I think that Glass-Steagall was, remember, it had lasted since 1931. There had not been banking collapses or disasters in America since 1931. And I think we have to separate the banking functions again. I know the big banks are going to scream and shout and hate it and not want to give up some of their power and dominance in the marketplace. But I think we have a responsibility to future generations to learn from what's gone wrong since this came to a head in 2008. So the answer is yes. You've got to remember that if you look at the leading politicians and bureaucrats of the day, most of them have very little understanding of economics. And we are run by a bunch of idiots. Your bloke in France, God help us. He's hopeless. He's hopeless. He becomes president. He ups the minimum wage. He reduces the retirement age from 62 to 60, and then wants to bring in a hate tax of 75%, just to make sure that if there are any entrepreneurs left in Paris, they're on the next Eurostar. How stupid can you be? So with some very stupid people in control, I also think that to a very large extent, our political class are scared of the banks because they and the banks have been in this together and this whole mess that's been created over time. And thirdly, they are the status quo, back to where we started this interview. And status quos, however rotten they may have become, always do everything they can to defend themselves. So the answer is easy. New politicians with fresh ideas, not linked to the banks and the failure of the past. It's intellectual corruption. Is it financial corruption? Well, I'm not qualified to say. Maybe it is. But I think that matters less. I think what matters is we've got a banking and political system that has delivered failure, and the remedy that we're being told is effectively more of the same, and that simply isn't good enough. Well, I personally want a model of free trade. Let's buy and sell our goods to each other, freed from tariffs and excessive import controls and duties. Fine, happy with that. I also think that because France and Britain and Britain and Germany and France and Germany, we're roughly similar. French people aren't living a life that is better or worse than English people. We're roughly similar. You can argue whether your hospitals are better than ours or not, and maybe they are, But overall, we're relatively similar. So I think we in the north of Europe can also be quite relaxed about the free movement of people. So if you want to come and live in London, that's fine. And if I want to come and live in Paris or Marseille, that's fine. Where that doesn't work is with poorer countries, because the benefit system is greater in Britain than it is in Bulgaria. So you know, I think we can have a very modern relationship based on trade, cooperation, but political union between France and England, I'm sorry. We're entirely different countries. We have completely different views on many things. You know, we are very much more of a Anglo-Saxon, free market, free trade, pro-New York type of economic model. And you're very much more a country that wants the state to own many of your key industries. And again, I'm not saying you're worse than us or better than us, but they're different approaches. And certainly in terms of foreign policy and roles in the world, the French approach and the British approach are just completely poles apart. So I do not see any future for us together in a political union. I don't think it's desirable for either of us, but we can trade, do business, be friends. We'll have the odd argument. But, you know, we're going to have the odd argument whether we're in political union or not. And that, I think, is the proper modern 21st century approach. Well, there's a bigger concern in a way with Germany. I mean, just, you know, if we go back all the way to the early 50s, and the start of this political project, you know, the French thinking, the thinking of Monet and Schuman, I mean, it was Frenchmen that are responsible for this European Union. I mean, you are guilty, I'm sorry. No, but the thinking behind Monet and Schuman was that if you held Germany close, that she could never again become the dominant power in Europe. And that's much of the thinking, the intellectual thinking. And what's happened? The Germans have become the dominant force in Europe. I mean, they are completely the top dogs now in this system. You know, what Merkel says goes. So my concern is less about who Germany should ally with. My concern is the extent to which Germany now has economic power over so many of the other countries in Europe. And I think this is going to lead to a very, very serious problem. So it's already leading to one. I mean, effectively, what Angela Merkel is saying to the Mediterranean countries is you must become like the Germans. You must adopt a German work ethic, a German work culture. Well, with the best will in the world, you know, after a good lunch and a couple of glasses of Mediterranean red wine, this just isn't going to happen. Well, there isn't yet. There isn't yet. Nothing they've done, with all the hundreds of billions they've spent, with their wretched anthem and their flag and their Europe days and their attempts to indoctrinate school children and through the universities, and there is not the growth or development of a European demos in any way at all. In fact, the opposite is happening, and we're seeing a much stronger feeling, growth, revival, if you like, in feelings of patriotism or nationalism. Identity politics is back, and it's very powerful, it's very strong. And I would say to some extent, that's a good thing. But patriotism and nationalism are a bit like alcohol. You know, a couple of glasses makes you happier and makes the world feel like a better place. Too much is destructive and ruinous, both for yourself and everybody else around you. And whilst I want to see European democracies and European states and European identities, I'm slightly fearful that what we're seeing in Greece particularly is the rise of a new kind of Greek nationalism that actually, I mean, you know, talk is cheap, but in reality isn't far away from Nazism. And that is pretty worrying. And I've said ever since 1999, since I've been here, you may call this a project for peace, but if you force people against their will, or you ignore them in referendums, and you go on attempting to change people's nationality and identity, they will react viciously against it. And it's beginning to happen, and we should think long and hard about it. Well, the answer is no one knows. And everybody that tells you they know what's going to happen to the dollar or the price of gold, they're generally wrong. So, as I say, I spent 20 years in financial markets, and forecasting these things is very much more difficult than most people think it is. I do want to see a return to sound money. I think the rate at which Western governments are now borrowing more than they can spend every year, effectively we're stealing from our children and grandchildren. Because this burden, the British national debt is increasing by almost 10% per annum, and that's crazy. So I do want to see a return to sound money, but to me, a return to the gold standard would be a return to a system of fixed parities, which in construction is not very different to the euro itself. So I'm not convinced, whilst I understand the idea of money being backed by gold, the gold standard is a fixed parity system, and just look what it did to us all in the 1930s. Well, one of my biggest concerns actually is the movement of people within Europe. Because as I said to you, people don't leave Paris for London for benefits. They leave Paris for London because they're going to get a better tax rate. They leave Paris for London because somebody wants to employ them in London and give them a job. But what we are beginning to witness are people leaving Warsaw or soon Bucharest for London or elsewhere because they want to take advantage of the benefit system and the health system and the education system. And I think this massive transfer of people that is going on from Eastern Europe to Western Europe is unsustainable, is dividing societies, and is not healthy at all. So that is the intra-Europe element of this. As far as immigration from the rest of the world is concerned, look, we all have different histories and cultures. You have your North African recent past, we have a subcontinent and a Caribbean recent past, and we should make our own decisions as countries, what we think our own levels of immigration are. I think one of the basic facets of a state is it decides who comes to live in that state and on what terms. And I view these things as being national competencies and not something that should be done at European Union level. If we go on ignoring people, and if we keep them trapped inside the economic prison that is the euro, then there will be widespread disorder that may well verge on revolution. And who knows? The Civil War thing, I don't know. I don't want to make crazy predictions, but I tell you this. Gerry Adams, who was led Sinn Féin in Ireland, in Northern Ireland for many, many years, who, as you know, were very closely linked to the IRA terrorist organisation. He said once, we didn't fight the British for 500 years to have the island of Ireland governed by bureaucrats in Brussels and bankers in Frankfurt. I suggest we take his words seriously. There is always the danger that the Middle East will prove a flashpoint for a deterioration of relations between Russia and America. I don't know the answer to that question. I hope not. And however horrible things in Syria may look, I just hope and pray that the Americans don't get involved. Because with the exception of liberating France from the occupying Germans, it seems to me that most things the Americans have done in foreign policy since then have actually made situations worse and not better. I don't see any upside in intervening by us, the French, us, America, in this whole Syrian problem. But if we did, we may well find ourselves in direct competition with the Russians. I'm sorry for the people of Syria, but I'm not sure there's anything we can do. America, she's got to sort her debt out. She's got the disease we've got in Europe. She's in some ways got it even worse. America will not continue to be the dominant economy in the world unless she gets to grips with her debt problem. And clearly, there is a massive shift going on from west to east across this world in terms of influence and power. And every time these European institutions pass a new regulation or a new law that furthermore stifles competitiveness in this European Union, every time they pass one of those laws, I say to myself, I can hear millions of Indians and Chinese cheering, because we're literally handing away the power to be the rich, powerful nations on earth to them. My own guess is probably it'll be India in time that will emerge as the world's global superpower. But that's my little crystal ball moment. Doesn't mean I'm right, but that's my feeling. I think China has some huge potential social problems coming up. The lack of democracy, the sheer unhappiness of many of those living in the rural parts of China, the quite big cultural differences that exist between different parts of China. China is being held together by an old ailing communist regime attempting to control the internet, stop free speech and thought. They won't win forever. India, chaotic though it may be, is a functioning democracy. And I think in the end, that is what is going to come and help them. Plus also the Indians, they have this link through language with the English-speaking world. I know the French think we're teasing them, but the old Commonwealth has within it now 2 billion people. 2 billion people. It's potentially a very, very big marketplace, and India is better placed to take advantage of that than China is. If I was young and bright and with really good career prospects in France today, at age 21 years old, I'd go and work abroad for a bit. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. When you introduce, when you try and introduce taxes of 75%, it just says to people, this is no place to be. So France's danger is that she'll suffer what the Brits did in the 70s, when we had a tax rate of 83%, and many of our brightest and best people did leave. Doctors, scientists, inventors, all the kind of people that you want in society. So there is a big, big risk that the best French people will leave. And at some point in the next few years, confront reality. Do you want France to become a satellite state of Germany under German economic and political control? Is that what you want? Do you really want the Germans to beat you through this means? France is going to have, I'm afraid I believe that the French are going to have a very troubled decade ahead. Very troubled, because it's going to take a long time for people in France in real numbers to wake up to the fact that they have made a fundamental mistake. Pegging France and Germany together in this way, in the long run, will not work. And I would say to the young people in France, you need to go and speak to your parents and grandparents, because they've got it wrong.
He said that wasn't good enough, and what I had to do was to apologise. I had to apologise to Herman Van Rompuy. I had to apologise to the European Parliament, and I had to apologise to the state of Belgium. Well, I made it clear to him that I wasn't prepared to apologise to any of them, but I would issue a full apology to bank clerks worldwide, just in case I'd offended any of them.